Well, good morning, everyone. Good morning. It's nice to see everyone. Yesterday, there was a question that came to me and about something that I skipped over. And I skipped over because I couldn't come up with really what it meant. And with much prayerful, it's in 1 Samuel 10, verse 12. I skipped over that verse because truly I looked at it, I looked at the original meaning of the words, and I couldn't figure out what God was saying. And so today, with much prayer, I think I can give you some explanation of it. So the verse is actually, "Then a man from there answered and said, 'But who is their father?'" So this is amongst the, when Saul goes and he's prophesying, and again I try when they came to the hill, there was a group of prophets that met him, and the Spirit of God came upon him, and he prophesied among them. And it happened when all who knew him formerly saw that he indeed prophesied among the prophets. And then again, this is the one. "What is this that has come upon the son of Kish? Is Saul also among the prophets?" And then, of course, our verse. "Then a man from there answered and said, 'But who is their father?'" And truly, I am thankful that question was asked, because I think that's a huge gem in there. What does that make you think of when Christ went into his own town? What did they say to him? Right? So now it came to pass when Jesus had finished these parables, he had departed from there. When he had come to his own country, he taught them in their synagogues, so that they were astonished and said, "Where did this man get this wisdom and these mighty works? Is this not the carpenter's son? Is this the son of Kish?" Right? "Is this not his mother called Mary?" And of course, Jesus goes on to say, "A prophet is not without his honor except in his own country, in his own house." And there's actually several references to it. That's the most powerful echo I can think of what he was, this person who was, and basically there was somebody in attendance, somebody from the area who said that. That's the best interpretation of those words. But who is their father? It's sort of like who is that? Who is teaching? And to me, that's the best echo I can come up with of what that means. I don't know if anybody's ever studied that, but what a huge gem. It shows you how Saul was, right? God put him in position, and I've been thinking over the last few days, what is it I'm really talking about? And Brother John's book, "To Speak Well of God," right? While this isn't the context, I think what the story of Saul is about is how God is working with us. No matter who we are, he keeps trying for us to turn, to repent, to come back. And I think our reading, again, bears that out. So I'm thankful for the question. And I think that was a huge gem that was missed. And of course, I pray, and I'm saying, please, God, help me understand this. And this came in. So hopefully that's so far, and maybe there's a different one, but that's the best one I come up with. And again, there's several echoes but that one really stands out as what may be. So let's kind of review a little bit for those who might be new. Class 1, we talked a little bit about Saul, his family, the tribe of Benjamin, who Saul was from, a little bit of history of the Benjamites. My curiosity got the best of me, and which it often does. It's a strength, and it's a great weakness. I always tell people one of my great strengths is asking a lot of questions, trying to uncover what's going on. The downside is I ask a lot of questions when I should just be quiet. So there's sometimes that's a strength. My greatest strength is my greatest weakness. I'm sure that's a quote from somebody I've heard of in life. So what I was curious about was what might have influenced Saul's upbringing, the city, worship. What was the timeline? Judges 19 talks a lot about the 19 through 21 talks about the Benjamites. It's almost the Sodom and Gomorrah story of the Israelites. And so the ark at that time, where was it? Where were they going to worship? Shiloh was where God originally first put his name, which again is told to us in Jeremiah chapter 7. In class 2, we talked a little bit about Saul as a shepherd, his yearly worship. My best current feeling is that Kish and Saul didn't necessarily go to the yearly worship, although I'm sure I could be debated in that. And then we talked about the Samuel circuit. So it would have been not very far from where Saul was raised in Kish and Gibeah. And then again, God teaches Saul to me at every turn, and that's what today is really about. Ultimately, I haven't been able to come up with any creative titles to catch you, but that was the best I could come up with. So this class, we're going to talk a little bit about God, just as a way of reminder that God 3 times did He anoint Saul or appoint Saul as the ruler, as the governor, as the king, ultimately, as we come to know. So there's one privately, where it was just him and Samuel, and then there was 2 publicly. And so these are the spaces where they were. First is up. Sorry, I'm turning away from my mic. I should need to turn. Mitzvah and Gilgal. And of course, Gilgal was famous for what? Circumcision. We heard yesterday, right? But ultimately, that's where they stopped when they first came over into the land. And of course, we know that Jericho and Ai, and from there a lot of the stories. So there's where he was anointed ultimately as the king in different settings, in 2 group settings. The Battle of Jabesh-Gilead, and after the Battle of Jabesh-Gilead, and I started to touch on this a little bit yesterday, after Brother Glenn and Brother John spoke. I missed my fiery in chapter 12 when Samuel preaches to the entire group, and remember that Saul is there and he saw the power of God, and I want to go back to that, which is after chapter 11 and the Battle of Jabesh-Gilead. So quickly, here's the 3 times that when he was in Sup, he's traveling to go find the donkeys, just to kind of bring the story back. I did try to go back. I got a request from my bride of 41 years to please make those pictures bigger or make the maps bigger, so I went back through trying to make them bigger for those who can't see. Again, privately, we're told that Samuel took a flask of oil and poured it on his head and kissed him and said, "Is it not because the Lord has anointed you commander over his inheritance?" So again, what is Samuel doing? He's preaching them. You're becoming this not because of your own, something you earned. This is because God has picked you, right? And so when he first comes, and this is where he doesn't seem to know Samuel by face, although you could argue whether that means anything or not. But when he first introduces him, after he said, "Yes, I'm the seer," and again, what was the desire of the Israelites? To have a king. Right? We read that in chapter 8. So, in whom all the desires of Israel, is it not on you in your father's house? And then publicly, he calls everybody together at Mitzvah. And, and ultimately, we talked a little about the family of Matri. I'm sure I'm saying that all wrong, but who that was one of the tribes that Saul and Kish, and the Saul son of Kish was chosen. And again, so that one was done publicly, and that's the representation of public and private. And then the next time is in 1 Samuel 11, after the Battle of Jabesh-Gilead. We'll talk a little bit about that today. But Samuel sends everybody to Gilgal to renew the kingdom there. And it says, "Now Samuel said to all of Israel, 'Indeed, I have heeded your voice and said to you and made you a king, and now here he is, the king walking before you.'" So again, and they, of course, a couple times say, "Long live the king." So the Israel's desire was the king, and Saul was that. So these are the 3 times that, and I always think of 3s, right? When it's 3s, what typically is God doing? He's confirming it, right? So the Battle of Jabesh-Gilead, we'll start there. So Jabesh-Gilead is up. Let me get back a little ways here. Jabesh-Gilead is quite a distance from Gibeah, where home is. So if we start walking through the story, the children of Israel had returned home from Mitzvah, and then there was, from Jabesh-Gilead, this blue line represents some, I almost said spies, but they were people bringing word to say that the children well, let me just read it. And Nahash the Ammonite came up and encamped against Jabesh Gilead. And all the men of Jabesh Gilead said to Nahash, make a covenant with us, and we will serve you. So the Ammonite king comes up against Jabesh Gilead, and of course, and Nahash the Ammonite answered them, on this condition I will make a covenant with you, that I may put out all your right eyes, and bring a reproach on Israel. It's kind of interesting, there were some that actually followed that. If you look at some history, who would agree to that? Giving up your right eye.
Left-handed person.
There you go. Well, that would scare me anyhow. I don't even know what that would feel like or what it would be like, but it looks like it would hurt. So, anyhow, the elders of Jabesh Gilead said, this is really an interesting thing. Now, put yourself in a general and a battle mode that you're going to take over an area, right? So the elders of Jabesh Gilead said to him, right, hold off. He said to Nahash, the king of the Ammonites, hold off for 7 days, that we may send a messenger to all the territory of Israel, and then, if there is no one to save us, we will come out to you. Would you agree to that if you're the general of the Ammonites? Doesn't even make sense, right? I mean, this is your time to go get them, right? They've seized them. Of course, we know who's in control. God, right? So verse 4, so the messengers, that's who it is, the blue line represents the messengers, I couldn't think of the term, came to Gibeah of Saul and told the news in the hearing of the people. So, meanwhile they come, and Saul is actually not there. And we talked a little bit about this yesterday, about him being a shepherd. It says, and all the people lifted up their voices and wept. Now there was Saul coming behind the herd from the field, and Saul said, what troubles the people that they weep? And they told him the words of the men of Jabesh Gilead, and the Spirit of God, whatever that looks like, came upon Saul when he had heard the news, and his anger was greatly aroused. I know I'm reading this, but you have the ability to read yourself. But to tell, again, so you can picture Jabesh Gilead's in trouble. They send messengers down to Saul, and again, Saul heard the news. The Spirit of God came upon him, and he was angry and greatly aroused. Now, this next verse 7, there's an echo here to something that happened in Judges. So he took a yoke of oxen and cut them in pieces and sent them throughout all the territory of Israel by the hands of messengers, saying, whoever does not go out with Saul and Samuel to battle, so it shall be done to his oxen. Now, we saw the battle yesterday, right? And the battle of Deborah bringing, 2 tribes come and then ultimately more. That was Saul's way of getting them aroused. It's kind of interesting. It makes you think of Judges 19. What did the Levite do? He cut up his concubine, and they sent it to different parts, and that's what brought them down, the whole armies of Israel, down to Gibeah to destroy the Benjamites. And so, again, does any of Saul's history make him think to do that? Is that something that he thought up on his own? I'm not so sure, but for sure that's a really interesting way to rouse the people to come. But, the big but, it says, and the fear of the Lord fell on the people, and they came out with one consent. So, again, I think while this happened, the fear of the Lord came upon the people, right? Not because the oxen went out there. And I think Samuel's here. Samuel actually goes to the battle with him. Couldn't Samuel have said, hey, let's all go up there? And I think that might have followed him. I don't know. Maybe there's plenty that wouldn't, same as during Deborah's time. I'm not sure. But anyhow, it's pretty dramatic. It says, when he numbered them at Bezek, which is again right here. So this all happened within 7 days. 7 days. The messengers had to come down. Remember, what did he say? Give us 7 days before you do anything and we'll let you know. Right? So in 7 days they traveled to Gibeah, told the story. The oxen are cut up. messengers, obviously had to go fast to all the children, and they all gather at Bezek. So, again, the children of Israel were 300,000, and the men of Judah, 30,000. So why do we know that? Why are they separated there? I'm not sure I have a good answer for you, but that aroused 330,000 people to come from the area to all go to Bezek to gather together, and they knew, and again, for the battle itself. So God was obviously with them, but it seemed to draw them all there. But there was some that didn't come. So as they said to the messengers who came, thus you shall say to the men of Jabesh Gilead tomorrow. They came up, and then the messengers went back and said, told them what was going on. Thus you shall say to the men of Jabesh Gilead tomorrow, by this time the sun is hot, you shall have help. Right? So they come up there, and again, now be the general of the Ammonites for a second here. So the men of Jabesh Gilead go and tell the Ammonite king, tomorrow we will come out to you, and you may do with us whatever seems good to you. So what did he do? What did they do? Deceive him, right? Absolutely 100% deceived him by what they were about to do. Of course, if I'm about to be killed, I probably would say anything as well. I don't know. So possibly, and I really think that this is pretty powerful in light of what we talked about yesterday with Deborah, the army, Barak. I'm sure I'm saying that wrong, but so they gather together. And in this particular case, this was the way that Saul gathered them. But I really believe that the Lord gathered them there, and I think that will prove itself out. So it was on the next day. There's not a lot about the battle. They break up into 3 groups, and they take Jabesh Gilead out, right? So it was on the next day, Saul put the people in 3 companies, and they came in the midst of the camp in the morning watch and killed the Ammonites until the heat of the day. And it happened that those who survived were scattered so that there was no 2 of them left together. So they came and they truly battled. I don't know if this is the battle of that, but it's the closest picture I can find of a battle. So one of the things that's not there is, did he inquire of the Lord? Right? We know oftentimes David, and we'll see this in Saul's probably tomorrow, we'll see that Saul does ask the Lord, but in this case they didn't. And the fact that Samuel went with them, I think, is the reason it's not necessarily mentioned there, because who would have, and we'll talk a little bit about this tomorrow too, who would have been the seer that he went to tell him what to do? Would have been Samuel. That's pure speculation. So then the people said to Samuel, and this is the part that I think reveals Saul at this stage of his life. So who is he who said, shall Saul reign over us? Bring the men that they may put them to death. This is the people saying this to Samuel. So Samuel's there. But Saul said, not a man shall be put to death this day, for today the Lord has accomplished salvation in Israel. So again, he gives credit to the Lord for this victory, doesn't he? So, where is that from? Who rejected him? Again, if we go back to 1 Samuel 10:26, and Saul went home to Gibeah. This is after he was announced. And all the valiant men went with him, whose hearts God had touched. But some rebels said, how can this man save us? Right? And so they despised him and brought him no presents. But he, Saul, held his peace. He didn't do anything to them there. I think that tells you a little bit about his character. He doesn't know. Again, he's the guy that hid himself when he was going to be announced as king. So Saul gives praise to God for winning the battle. I think that says something about Saul, again, where he was at this stage. And you can think about that for a minute. So after the battle, again, this is the Ammonites traveled up here, but after the battle, Then Samuel says, and this is the end of chapter 11, and I think this, again, tells you that Samuel was there. Then Samuel said to the people, "Come, let us go to Gilgal and renew the kingdom there." So here they kind of wavered going there. Here they went in a straight line and then straight over. That's because I couldn't make a wavy line to say that. My humor's not working very good at all today, is it? So anyhow, this is them traveling back from here. Now again, I could make the argument that Samuel wasn't with them, but I think Samuel was with them, and because he knows about what happened. Now somebody could tell him, right? So all the people went to Gilgal, and so there they made Saul king before the Lord in Gilgal, which we just talked about. There they made sacrifices and peace offerings to the Lord, and there Saul and the men of Israel rejoiced greatly. So they rejoiced, they were thankful to God for the battle win, and the sacrifices were made, and that will mean something more tomorrow. We know that for those who know Saul, the story of Saul pretty well, know that has some meaning we'll be talking about. Time do we have? Sure. Okay, what's that?
22 minutes.
22 minutes. So I can talk fast then? Okay, so we can see all these things that happened to Saul, all the people of Israel. They win a great battle. For years under Samuel, there was no Philistines attacking them. So this would have been a battle that would have come on that they hadn't really seen in a while. As a matter of fact, if you read some of the details, where they had their spears and their weapons of war made were by the Philistines. So there's even a point with which you can't go to the Philistines to get their swords sharpened when they're going to go to battle with the Philistines. So they weren't self-sufficient in weapons of war at that time as well, and we won't necessarily go into that, but I think this is the story that I wanted to make sure I spent a little more time on, because, again, as we go through life, God is working with us at every turn. I believe that. I believe everybody that maybe have walked away, God has not given up on them. There's things that we can see that will come to our mind, even no matter how flesh we get, things will happen that make us think. So regardless, and I'm sure everybody in here has those moments. So God is teaching Saul, the new king, and I really believe that kind of goes to who God is and what we talked about, that little gem that I skipped over that we looked at earlier, that God is working with the kings of men. I love the story about the axe, right? So he borrows his neighbor's axe and the thing falls in the water and God makes it float. That was probably the livelihood of the person, and I think that's an awesome story. That's how much that he cares about in our life. You know, oftentimes, how many times you would like, I don't want to pray for that because it's like so minor. I'm going to bother God, the creator of heaven and earth, for those little things. But there's a lot of little things that we know in the scriptures that help us. So, we move on to chapter 12, and again at the very beginning, the coronation ultimately of the king of Saul. So then Samuel said to the people, and this is where the preaching begins. I'm not going into every little detail, but it is the Lord who raised. So picture this: they're all gathered in Gilgal at this point, and Samuel begins to preach to the group. So what is the most important thing that they should remember? It is the Lord who raised up Moses and Aaron, and who brought your fathers up out of the land of Egypt. That speaks volumes. That speaks volumes to those who would have been there. It is God who raised them up, right? Called Moses. Moses needed Aaron to speak. And that's how they got where they're at. So there's like this very basic teaching, right? We talk about the basics of the teachings. There Samuel starts there. Now therefore stand still, that I may reason with you before the Lord concerning all the righteous acts of the Lord, which he did to you and your fathers. So who is that speaking about? God. Samuel is preaching God, and that's the whole, I think, the whole premise in the Saul story. While there's a lot of sad points, God continues, Samuel's preaching that God is there. God will take care of these things. God did these things for our purpose, just like in our own lives. So then, now therefore, here is the king whom you have chosen and whom you have desired, which is kind of interesting. God gives them a king, but then, and take note, the Lord has set a king over you, right? So again, confirming that. If you fear the Lord and serve him and obey his voice and do not rebel against the commandment of the Lord, then both you and the king who reigns over you will continue following, over you will continue following the Lord your God. Things will go well, and I think there's probably not again, this is so packed with teaching. Again, think about all the children of Israel gathered there and saw the king hearing these very things that would have helped him, right? So the great thing, I was talking to Peter this morning, we talked about music and things that you say over and over in your head. I find myself singing the songs as I go along, especially my favorites, and I heard a few of them in the prelude side. And I think that's great. To have those songs in your head, to have those verses, to have the things to draw on, because what did Jesus do his whole life? He recalled the teachings of God to overcome the things that he was facing. And I think that's the power of what these things being put in our head and continuing to read them, the scriptures, as we're learning from Brother Glenn and Brother John, there's so much depth in the scriptures that maybe I told the story already, but my neighbor, we invited him over one Sunday. We were having church at our house, and they're Jewish, and they came over, and it was really great to have them. And a couple of weeks later, he came over and he said, "How do you read the Bible that many times and not, you got the story, what else do you need?" So just a little backstory, he's an avid reader. And he reads 2 or 3 books a week, there are stories, right? And so for him, once you got the story down, what do you need to read the book for again, right? So explaining to him, it was a chance, but at least he recognized that we were doing that. And so meanwhile, it didn't come to anything yet. He's still alive, but so the opposite does, however, if you do not obey the voice of the Lord, and think about down through time of the kings that I wanted to spend a little bit more time on, but however, if you do not obey the voice of the Lord, but rebel against the commandment of the Lord, then the hand of the Lord will be against you as it was against your fathers. So that's a pretty powerful statement, right? We know that there was oral traditions and they learned these stories, so that would have been a great reminder to them, wouldn't it? But if I'm so caught up in the world, and so steep that I think the idols in my house are helping me or providing things for me, then I may not even hear something as powerful as that statement. So, the story of the parable of the seed being sown, right? So some come up quick and die off. We talked a little bit about that. And then some go into rich soil. It's very likely that they all go back. They're all excited. They get back home and there's the God in the house, and next thing you know, they're right off to doing the right. So our comparison would be, we get home and we don't use anything that we learned, whether it's on Sunday morning or a Bible study class. I think that's the power of what, just having these in our head, even here today, they're very powerful. So now, therefore, stand and see the great thing which the Lord will do before your eyes, right? And so, is today not the wheat harvest? I will call the Lord, and he will send thunder and rain, that you may perceive and see that your wickedness is great, that you have done in the sight of the Lord in asking a king for yourselves. So this is still a pretty serious thing that they have rejected God as king, correct? Yeah. Just want to make sure we got the signals right. So they rejected him, and you can just imagine being there. What is this an echo of? The Mount, right, of Horeb, right? When God comes down and speaks to them, they all said, "Hey, Moses will listen to you. You talk to God." I don't want to face that again, right? That thundering and lightning. So Samuel called the Lord, and think about this. Here's a prophet of the Lord, the seer. Saul went to go see. he calls in front of all of them, right? So they're all gathered together. And Samuel called the Lord, and the Lord sent thunder and rain that day, and all the people greatly feared the Lord and Samuel. That's probably a good thing, right? Fear isn't necessarily fear I'm afraid, but fear is reverence. So, as you can see, I took a liberty and I found a picture with lightning in it, so I'm assuming a lot of times, at least in my lifetime, whenever there's thunder, there's some sort of lightning, right? So, a fairly scary scene. And all the people said to Samuel, "Pray for your servants to the Lord your God, that we may not die. For we have added to all our sins." Again, idol worship was still there. There was still, and again, if you study this more deeply, there was a lot of that going on. Added to our sins the evil of asking for a king for ourselves. So this is a very serious thing reminding them, but even though they asked, God took care of them, didn't he? I always think of the story of David and Bathsheba and, the terribleness of what David did there, but Solomon comes through there, and the line of Christ comes through that situation. So, positive, for the Lord will not forsake his people for his great name's sake, because it has pleased the Lord to make you his people. Sorry, I meant to read this. Yet do not turn aside from following the Lord, but serve the Lord with all your heart, and do not turn aside. That's a strong message for all of us in this room, as well as it would have been for them standing before Samuel at Gilgal. Again, God will not forsake his people. And I think that's the part that we have to remember, that, oftentimes I know we've had a few discussions about people who have possibly walked away and, hey to them, and what do you do? I think that's always a challenge. I think God is working with them, but we can always check on them, send them a card, do something that I'm not necessarily really good at, as I should be. But I think that's a really powerful thing that we can be part of, helping and serving the Lord. Moreover, as for me, far be it from me, this is Samuel talking, that I should sin against the Lord, ceasing to pray for you, but I will teach you the good and the right way. And if you remember, I had the very verse up there that said, when God said to Samuel, why do you keep mourning for Saul? I've rejected him as king. I picked David, and yet here he was not going to cease praying for the people who would have asked for that. So only fear the Lord, serve him in truth with all your heart, for consider what great things he has done for you. But if you still do wickedly, you shall be swept away, both you and your king. So as long as you're alive, we have a chance. Correct? We do. And so the point I want to make is Saul is hearing this, just like all the other children of Israel. God has continued to remind them. There's several stories like this, and we'll talk about this probably more on Saturday, of David, God through David still preaching to Saul right up until he died, trying to get him to turn back from some of the things that he was doing. And I think that goes on no matter who you are. God is trying to win those. So tomorrow, did I get an S? I might be early. What's that? See, I could have talked at fewer words per minute, and I didn't. So. Anyhow, so tomorrow we'll look at Saul's unlawful sacrifice at Gilgal. Why was it unlawful on the 7 days that he was supposed to wait for Samuel? Very interesting. I was talking to Brother John about this last night. I don't think God holds us accountable to anything that we don't understand or we don't know, in a sense. And there's a pretty clear scripture that Saul would have known that. And what were the consequences? And then Saul's battle with the Amalekites, and this is where he begins to, again, the second time, fail. So these are two things where he has failed. And the one thing that I think about, and I'll leave you with, is, I have sinned, I have transgressed, please pardon my sin. Saul says that to Samuel. David, if you remember Nathan coming to him and said, you are the person, and by the way, your sin is forgiven. It's a little bit different in Saul's case, and I think there's where it begins to say, that we ourselves need to look at our own hearts, just as God is looking at the heart, so we can work on making those changes, because what is the end, right? I remember when old people used to stand up here, people my age today, and would say things like that, and I think, oh yeah, they're just old people that don't understand all this stuff, right? But you realize what else is there? What's our other choice? To eternally be dead, or to serve God and the enjoyment, right? So I think that's come out here already, is the things that God has prepared. It's worth making the changes. And yet we know that's a struggle our entire life. I'm sure everybody in the room. So thank you.
You're welcome to the extra